Okay.
The faith of Isaiah.
With narration by James Day.
Yeah.
That's Isaac.
Except it's not Isaiah.
I mean, Isaiah had faith too.
Yes, he did. But
Isaiah.
Isaiah, yeah.
Isaiah.
That's how you say like mosaic.
Mosaic.
If you're talking about Isaac, it's Isaic.
There you go.
Isaiah
Okay.
covenant.
The Isaiah covenant, yeah.
Well, I'm Southern, so Isaiah.
So in Southern Isaiah, Isaac is Isaiah.
Okay, anyway, I'll edit all that out.
I think you should leave it. It's real.
You're gonna edit out my. No.
Yes, I'm
Your
gonna edit you
narration.
out.
Yeah, Chuck, you gotta keep it real.
This is how church really is at this
He
house.
may lose some followers.
Well, I thought I liked this Chuck poor guy, but I don't know. What kind of church is he?
Unsubscribe.
What kind of church is this guy running?
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Good morning. Okay, this morning we're going to be talking about the faith of Isaac. He's the next hero of faith that is in our list. Now, of course, we've met Isaac before, because obviously we were just talking about him a few weeks ago when we during the story of Abraham. Because, of course, if you remember, there were 3 events that were in Abraham's life that the author of Hebrews focused on. And the third one was, of course, Genesis 22, and when God called him to sacrifice Isaac. So we kind of already met Isaac, but it was all focused on the Abraham perspective of it and his side of it. And so now he mentions Isaac, but it's interesting that he really, the author of Hebrews only gives him 1 verse. And he really kind of, I guess he sees him as sort of a transitionary figure in terms of how it relates to the argument that he's making in Hebrews 11. He spent a lot of time on Abraham, and he's just going to spend a little time on Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and then he spends a lot of time on Moses. So clearly, Abraham and Moses is where he wanted to focus in Hebrews chapter 11. So that's where he spends more of his time. But he does hold this particular place as an example of faith. Now, before I get into, and again, just like with Abraham, Isaac's life is several chapters in the book of Genesis, and we could spend 12 weeks talking about the life of Isaac, and we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus really on a couple of highlights that relate to what the Hebrews author mentions as far as Isaac is concerned. But before I really get into that, and I didn't put it in the notes because it wasn't really what the author of Hebrews mentioned, so it's not part of really the text, but I can't help but think about it. So this is more a little Chuck's edition editorial comment. And that is, even though the author of Hebrews doesn't mention it, I cannot help but say that we need to give Isaac some credit in terms of his level of faith and trusting relating to his side of the story in Genesis 22. We talked all about Abraham and how he trusted God in telling him to offer his son, his one and only son, to be sacrificed. And it was all about Abraham trusting God that that he would raise him back from the dead, as the author of Hebrews said was in his mind. We don't talk much about Isaac's perspective of that whole story. All we really get is when they're cutting the kindling and all that, and he's like, well, Dad, I see the wood, and I see the rope, and I see the knife, and all of this, but I don't see the sacrifice. And that's, of course, when Abraham says that very famous, God will provide the lamb. And he says, oh, okay. But that's really all that we hear from Isaac in that passage. But then just think about it for a minute, when they get up to the hill, and they build a little altar, and then, and then Abraham's like, okay, son, lay down here on the altar, He starts wrapping the rope around him, and, from a human standpoint, Isaac is, am I missing something here? Clearly, if Isaac was not willing to go through with that on his side, I mean, we're talking about Abraham is a 90-something dude by this time, and we don't know exactly how old Isaac is at this point. It doesn't really say. The text, the way it's translated in the NIV, calls him a boy, and I've actually seen artistic representations that kind of imply that he's a child. But then I've also heard more like, as far as readings, scholarly history, that more like he was a teenager or a young adult.
Yeah.
We don't really know. Either way, clearly, if Isaac didn't want to be sacrificed, there's not much way Abraham could have forced him to do it. Even if he was still just a little kid, I mean, he could run, and ain't no way Abraham could catch him.
Don't tell.
The point is, when it became obvious what was to happen, Isaac, like Jesus, laid down his life. Because Abraham couldn't have forced him to do it. And so we talk about Abraham's faith, but we very rarely talk about Isaac's faith in that moment, in trusting his father that this was the right thing to do, in trusting God, and maybe just like Hebrews says that Abraham believed that God could raise him from the dead, maybe Isaac believed the same thing. Maybe they even talked about it, that maybe Isaac believed that he would be raised from the dead, or that something would happen. And of course something did. But the point is, let's give Isaac credit for faith there too. And even though the author of Hebrews doesn't mention it, so this is just Chuck talking, not the author of Hebrews. But I think we should say, by faith Isaac laid down his life, just like Jesus. No man took it from him, he laid it down. Because Abraham couldn't have forced the issue if he wasn't willing. And I don't hear that talked about very much. I'm surprised he doesn't get a little more credit for that. But clearly he had some faith at that point too.
Yeah, just lay there and get tied up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, so let's focus now on what the author of Hebrews points out, and what he has seen. And the one verse that the author of Hebrews focuses on is the issue of the passing on of the blessing, so from father to son. And so that's what's important to the argument of the author of Hebrews. In my opinion, the reason that's what he's focusing on is because that is sort of this, what you might call the sequence of how the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, passes on through the generations from father to son. And that aspect of it was what was important to the author of Hebrews in regards to Isaac's faith. So that's why so we're going to focus on some highlights from these passages that have to do with the blessing part of it, the passing on of the blessing. So we're going to start in Genesis 25 in verse 19, which is kind of where Isaac's main story starts. But even though it's supposedly about Isaac, it's really more about the kids, Jacob and Esau, because that's, of course, where the blessing is being passed on to. So it's like, even though it's Isaac that he's mentioning, it's really all about Jacob and Esau that this whole thing revolves. So verse 19 of Genesis 25 says, this is the account, of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. And can you believe I said all those names?
You did lovely.
I know. So then it says, continuing on in verse 21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. So again, even though it is Isaac's faith that's lifted up here as an example of faith by the author of Hebrews, it is really his actions concerning his two sons that are in view here. So talking about the kids is what's going to be important in this narrative. So what it says in verse 22, the babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, the reason that I went back and talked about this particular verse, because I think this is not just an important, but I think it's a vital kind of background that we need to keep in mind as we look at what happens later between Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau. I think if we didn't have this in the back of our mind as sort of the foundation, it would be easy for us to think that what happened with Rebekah and Jacob in particular was some frustration of God's plan, some subversion of what God would have wanted, since it was clearly subverting what Isaac had intended. But what we have to understand here is even before these children were born, God already had it in His plan that He was going to essentially subvert what would be the cultural norm. We've talked about this before, but in this patriarchal society, the cultural norm is the elder son is the prominent one. The elder son is the one who becomes the lord of the family, becomes the patriarch when the father dies. He has the greater part of the inheritance. He has the greater of everything. Any kind of blessings or anything like that, or authority or whatever, just like thinking about a king and the prince, any authority that is invested in the father passes through the eldest son. That's just the way that things were back then. The eldest son had prominence. Well, even before the children were born, God had already proclaimed to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger. That is, the younger of the two would be prominent. The younger of the two was going to be chosen. And what he's implying here, which is in fact what happened, is that the younger son would be the one through whom the covenant would go, which would include being the father of the nation, and eventually, though it's not mentioned in this particular passage, we just know eventually through which the Messiah would come. They would be the younger, not the elder. This was, in some ways, God's way of subverting or saying, my plan is based on my ways and my will, not yours.
And it happened again through Joseph.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
Joseph was the 11th.
Absolutely.
Was the 11th son.
Absolutely.
And that's why his older brothers didn't like him.
It's almost, it's that whole my ways are not your ways. It's that whole thing of what we expect is the way it's going to happen is not the way.
Mm-hmm.
Just like with Jesus, everybody was expecting the Messiah would be a big conquering king. He was going to be, some big warrior, soldier, king thing. And he turned out to be just this little, insignificant at the time. I mean, later he wouldn't be, but at the time, insignificant carpenter, as you said, the suffering Savior instead of the conquering hero. I mean, God's always doing things the way we don't expect.
Yeah.
And like you said, with Joseph was another perfect example, And he chooses, God chooses many times the weaker thing to be what he uses as his instrument. And so this is one of those examples. And he reveals this to Rebekah. So we have to keep that in mind, that when we look at what eventually happened. And another aspect of this is that sometimes it doesn't make sense in a way, but at the same time it's reassuring. That no matter how much we as humans mess things up, and insert our own plans and even sometimes our own sinful actions
God still uses
into things, God still works His will. We can't frustrate God's plan. And sometimes it's not, and you have to be careful how you say this, I'm not saying that sometimes God causes people to sin, but God is powerful enough and wise enough to use the outcome of someone's sin for His actual glory. And this is an example here. And of course, the perfect example of that, of course, is the crucifixion. I mean, if you think of that purely in a moral, legal, sense, that was a travesty of justice. Jesus was innocent. It was wickedness to execute Jesus. He was innocent. It was a travesty of justice. But yet God used that sin. It was clearly a sin. Not to mention thinking about the treachery of Judas. That was clearly a wicked sin.
Yeah.
But yet it was all part of God's plan of redemption. This is the same thing. There are sins that happen. Lies and deceit and treachery. It's a soap opera, basically. Yet God uses it as part of His avenue of keeping His covenant. And of course, He already knew it was going to happen before it happened, because He's already declaring it even before the children are born. That the older will serve the younger. So God always intended for the younger brother to be the child of promise as far as the covenant. So we ought to keep that kind of as our foundation and our perspective when we look at the soap opera that happens later. So, in verse 24, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And the first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. And I'm like, wow, what a homely fucking baby. Yeah, don't really talk about it much, but I'm just like, can you just imagine seeing like this little monkey born, you know?
Chewbacca? Yeah.
Chewbacca, you know, and you're like, this one's not done, put it back. You know, I mean, talk about a homely baby, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not unusual that Rebecca had a favorite son, I don't know, but. So after this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, which is a word to kind of mean, the root of it is like to grab something, and to hold on, to grasp something. So, obviously, has nothing to do with the passage. It's just one of those things that nerdy me, I just can't help but thinking about. Even though they say they were twins, clearly they must have been fraternal twins and not identical twins, you know?
Yeah.
Since they physically did not look alike,
He was smooth skinned.
they must have been fraternal and not, and not identical twins. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, even though they were twins and essentially born on the same day, one obviously is born first, and that would be Esau, would be considered the elder brother, which was, of course, culturally very important. So, we see who was the favorite of who. So, it says that Isaac had a taste for wild game, and he loved Esau. And that's because Esau was a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman when he grew up. He might have been a kind of an ugly, homely baby, but I guess when he grew up, he was probably kind of a burly, outdoorsy kind of guy. And he was a skillful hunter, and I guess Isaac thought that was really good. He liked the outdoorsy guy. He liked the wild game. He was a man's man, Yeah, he's my eldest son. He's a hunter. He goes out there and kills stuff with his bare hands, Plus, he says he had a taste for wild game, and he would go out and hunt and bring him wild game. So he was Esau's favorite. But Jacob, the smooth-skinned boy, he stayed home. He was homeboy. Mama's boy, I guess. He was mama's boy. And he was probably prettier. So So he was kind of the homeboy, and he was always Rebecca's favorite. And also, of course, to be fair, Rebecca also had the perspective that God had told her that the elder would serve the younger. So she probably had that in the back of her mind.
That's what I was about to say. I wonder if that's why he was the favorite of her.
I think it was both. I think it was probably both. I mean, again, you don't want to read too much into it, but I mean, just being a human being, knowing that God had already told you that he was really going to be the prominent son, and that he was the one that stayed home and spent time with you instead of being out all the time like Esau was, it's not hard to see why. I mean, you shouldn't have favorites. I don't guess. I only had one kid, so I don't have any perspective about that. But obviously they did. So we already had this rivalry going on. and you know they had to know who was whose favorite. I mean, they had to know. I mean, it's not the kind of thing they wouldn't perceive. Maybe when they were little they didn't quite know it, but when they got older, clearly they would have realized who was whose favorite. But it was more than that, and I think this is, Esau, it says, despised his birthright. We won't go into all the details of the last part of chapter 25 just because of time, but you know the story, of course, where Esau's been out hunting, and he comes back and he's just famished, and Jacob's in the kitchen cooking a stew, and he must be a pretty good cook because it's smelling really good, and he's starving to death. And I know we use that term a lot of times when we come home from, I'm starved to death, I could eat a horse. We don't really mean that. I get Esau may have been out for days or weeks on a hunting trip, and he may not have eaten very much. He may really have been really weak and not eating well at that point. Maybe he didn't have a good hunting trip, he didn't catch anything or kill anything. So he may have, when he says he's famished to death, he probably wasn't meaning that metaphorically. He probably really and truly was in a bad way. But he smelled that stew cooking and said, can I have some of that? Give me some of that, Jacob. And Jacob, okay, I'll give it to you, but only if you sell me your birthright. I mean, taking advantage of his brother like that at a time, that's why I'm saying that it had to be more than just the metaphor that we say we're starving to death, because it's hard to imagine Esau being weak enough to actually fall for that if he really wasn't like, if I don't get something to eat, I'm going to pass out or something, But so he takes this moment of probably physical and perhaps emotional weakness on Esau's point and says, I'll only give you something to eat if you sell me your birthright. And he did. Because he says, in verse 32, look, I am about to die, Esau said. What good is the birthright to me? And that's why I'm saying I don't think it's a metaphor. I think he really felt like he was about to starve to death, and it wouldn't do him any good if he died to have the birthright. So Jacob says, and this is verse 33, but swear to me first. He doesn't trust him, I guess. That's why I say, Jacob, where's your mind? To be so this way about your brother, I don't know. It just seems very callous to me. And definitely taking advantage of the situation. So he swore an oath to him and selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave him some bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and got up and left. So Esau, this is the last verse of chapter 25, Esau despised his birthright. And the word there, it means basically to treat something with disdain, like it doesn't matter, like you don't care. So here we have what really sets up what happens at the end. We got, an elder and a younger, one a favorite of Isaac, one the favorite of Rebekah, and then one who has, in a moment of physical and emotional weakness, has basically felt like his particular birthright, his place as being the elder son, doesn't matter to him as much as physical pleasures or necessities of life. So he placed, something in the now. He placed his stress or struggle or trial of the moment above the long-term value of what he, basically had earned or had coming to him as the eldest son, his birthright. So that's kind of the backdrop then of what actually happens as we move into chapter 27, which is where the issue of the blessings come in that eventually the author of Hebrews will talk about. So in chapter 27, it begins when Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, and I'm getting to the point where I understand what the Bible means when it says things like that. So he calls for Esau, his older son, and says to him, my son, here I am, he answered. Isaac said, I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. So prepare for me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat so I can give you my blessing before I die. So Isaac is at that point in his life when he has recognized his mortality. And he is determined that it's time to set his affairs in order. Once again, I'm kind of at that point in my life when I've kind of started thinking about that too. I'm not as old as Isaac was at that point, probably, hopefully. But, I mean, I did come to the point where it was time to make sure I had my will and my life insurance and everything taken care of. So you get to that point in your life where things like that are on your mind. And so he realizes or senses that he's not long for this world, so he had this obligation culturally to his eldest son to pronounce this blessing on him. Now, again, this is sort of that cultural thing that it's hard for us to comprehend, or to appreciate maybe is a better word, is that this was much more than just like wishing his son well, or saying, boy, I hope you have a good life, I'm going to pray to God that he'll bless you. I mean, yeah, that's part of it, of course. But this is something a little more official. This blessing sort of confers upon him the role and responsibility of being the patriarch of the family. It's almost like a verbal version of a last will and testament, of saying, you're my eldest son, you're going to be the lord of the family, everything that was mine, all of my possessions, my land, whatever it is that he had, it's all going to be yours. And also, I think, any blessings that were on Isaac, he's passing on to his son. So, Esau, of course, because he knows of the covenant that God made with his father, Abraham, and he knows he was the recipient of that covenant and part of the chain of that covenant going from Abraham to their descendants. So, naturally, he would assume that his eldest son Esau would be the next in line in the covenant. And from his perspective, this is what he's doing. He's passing it along to, the blessings of the covenant to his eldest son Abraham. His eldest son Esau from his father Abraham. However, plot complications ensue. Because in verse 5 it says, Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son. Now we already know that Jacob is Rebekah's favorite. And she hears what's about to happen. And she decides it's time for her to intervene because she had other ideas for Esau and Jacob. And I think, like we mentioned before, not only because Jacob is her favorite and she'd rather Jacob be getting the blessing of the eldest son, but she's got in the back of her mind probably what God had said. But here, she kind of like, Abraham and Sarah before, thinks that maybe she's got to help God along. God told her that, the elder would serve the younger, but I guess maybe she thought God needed her to help in this, so Rebekah says, I'll take care of this part. Not thinking that maybe God could take care of that on his own without her help. So she decides to help it along a little bit and intervene. So Esau says, yeah, Dad, and he heads out to go hunt. So Rebekah says to her son in the next few verses, 6 through 10, listen carefully and do what I tell you. I'll prepare the tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it, and take it to your father to eat so that he may give you his blessing before he dies instead of Esau. He'll give it to you instead. So she devises this trick to trick Isaac into taking advantage of his failing eyesight to get him to pronounce the blessing on Jacob instead. Now, Jacob isn't dumb. And he knows this isn't going to work because even though he knows his dad can't see well, he can still feel him. And he knows, hey, I'm the smooth-skinned boy and, Esau's all hairy and everything and he smells like the outdoors. It's never going to fool him. His eyes aren't working, but his nose still works. He can still feel, But Rebekah, she's already thought 2 steps ahead. And so basically Jacob has our first Halloween costume. As he puts on essentially an Esau suit. He dresses up as Esau. And so he puts on,
Started.
she goes and picks out some clothes of Esau's that smell like him. And they get the goat skin and put over his exposed neck and over his arms and everything. And so Rebecca goes and cooks up the tasty meal and sends Jacob in wearing his Esau suit. But Isaac is suspicious. Why? Because he came in so fast. We figured Esau would be gone for a while, to go hunt. And all of a sudden here he is with his food, and he just seemed like, wow, that was fast. And then Jacob, I said, where's your mind, Jacob? Because not only does he lie, but he brings God into it. It says, God, the Lord your God gave me success. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's bad enough to lie, but to bring God's name into your lie and say it was that it was God that brought me this success? I mean, lucky that God didn't just strike you right there, but he didn't.
Yeah.
And the thing is, though, once again, Isaac isn't stupid either, and he recognized Jacob's voice. It says, you sound more like Jacob.
Doesn't have that grizzled.
Yeah, really. But he draws him close and says, let me feel you. And he says, you smell like Esau. You feel like Esau. He must have had, I guess Esau had kind of that earthy outdoor smell to him.
Yeah.
He says, in verse 20, he said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. Which means he smells like dirt, basically.
Could be worse.
I mean, really, that's what he says. The smell of my son, like a field. Even though you sound like Jacob.
Yeah.
So, but they fool him. So then we get into in verse 28 is where he's finally satisfied that yes, that's Esau, and he gives him the blessing that he wanted to give him at this time. And he says, "May God give you of heaven's dew and of earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." So this is that official blessing that he's been waiting to pronounce on him, even though he thinks it's Esau. So essentially what he's doing, as we said, is through this blessing, he sort of officially, and from a cultural standpoint, I guess legally, he is investing the authority of the eldest son in Jacob, being the Lord of the family, and that everyone else in the family will bow down to you, including, the other brothers. And essentially, he sort of is indirectly referring to the Abrahamic covenant when he talks about that nations serve you, peoples bow down to you, and specifically that last phrase, those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. That was specifically part of the Abrahamic covenant, that whoever blesses the descendants of Abraham will be blessed, and whoever curses the descendants of Abraham will be cursed. Well, this is an extension of that. So he is essentially confirming, even though it's God that's made the covenant, he in some way feels like it's something he has to bequeath to his son, this particular blessing. So it's basically the plan has worked. But the deceit part of it doesn't last long. Because not long after that, here comes Esau. I don't know what Rebecca thought was going to happen when Esau came home. But here he comes. Esau comes, and he's got the kill that he was going to bring. And so, of course, everything comes out in the open, and Isaac realizes that Jacob has deceived him. But clearly, even though there was deceit, and it was not the son that he thought he was talking to, this is why I say that this wasn't just something that he just said. There's obviously legal ramifications to this pronouncement. It's almost like even though it's verbal, it has the force of a will, of a legal document. And it cannot be undone. So Jacob is now the holder of that blessing, and he's now the lord of the family when Isaac dies. And Esau is devastated. I mean, to the point of weeping. I mean, he is just devastated that he's been cheated out, of what was rightfully his. Now Jacob has now cheated him not once, but twice. First the birthright, and now the blessing. And he begs his father for a blessing. And he says in verse 36, he took my birthright and now he's taken my blessing. Then he asks, haven't you reserved any blessing for me? And this is why I say that clearly there's legal weight to what he did, because verse 37, Isaac answered Esau, I've made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine, basically everything, all of his possessions. So what can I possibly do for you, my son? He's basically given all that he can give to Jacob, and he has nothing more. But Esau continues to plead, do you only have one blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father. So Isaac gives him what blessing he can give him. And Isaac answered him in verse 39 and 40, your dwelling will be away from the earth's riches, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. And Esau's God's like, this is my blessing? But then he finally says, but when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. So it isn't much, but he is at least conferring upon him the ability to get out from and under Jacob eventually, that he will be able to live free of his lordship, if you will. But that's not much, but it's all that Isaac can legally give him, because he gave everything else to Jacob. So this, of course, this doesn't please Esau, obviously, and of course this becomes the source of great hatred and enmity for most of the rest of their lives. Basically up until the end, when they finally do have somewhat of a resolution later in life. But they are to the point where Esau wants to kill him. I mean, by the end of this chapter, he was trying to think of ways to kill him. This becomes a great source of hatred. So, in chapter 28, there is a second blessing given by Isaac to Jacob, and this one, I think, in many ways may be even more important. Verse 1 of chapter 28, so Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him and commanded him, and this is what he talks about his wife. But then, in verse 3, he begins to pronounce a blessing upon him. Now, I think this one is even more important and more significant, and may even be the part that the author of Hebrews has in mind when he's lifting up Isaac's faith. Why is this one, I think, more significant? And I think for two reasons. Number one, because in this case, he knows who he's talking to. This is Isaac not being tricked, not being deceived. This is Isaac freely of his own will giving this blessing knowingly to Jacob. So he's not being fooled in this case or doing this under false pretenses. That makes it much more significant. And secondly, while that first blessing back in the previous chapter had more to do with Jacob's place in the family, as lord of the family, and patriarch of the family, and heir of the estate, and that sort of thing, this blessing is specifically about the covenant. Now, he mentioned the covenant indirectly in the other blessing, as we said. But in this case, he almost restates it verbatim and makes it explicit that this is the covenant of God being placed upon Jacob as the next chosen son in line between Abraham and eventually the Messiah. So that is why this one is much more specific and much, I think, more important. And here's what he says beginning in verse 3. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of people. May He give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, the land God gave to Abraham. So he starts off saying, may God Almighty bless you. And the phrase God Almighty is the name El Shaddai. You've heard that song El Shaddai. This is one of the places where we see that. And of course El just means God, but Shaddai means literally a burly, powerful person. It has to do with the idea of being muscular, strong, able to do mighty things. So Isaac's blessing then is to bestow God's blessing on Jacob based on the power that God implies. In other words, it kind of has this idea of God taking action. It's not passive. It's like, I have it in my mind when I think about God as El Shaddai. It makes me think of the mighty, powerful things where God intervened to rescue or work in God's people's lives. And I think specifically about God bringing the Hebrews out of Egypt and parting the Red Sea and rescuing them from Pharaoh's army and leading them through the wilderness and taking care of them and giving them the manna and the water from the rock, and of course later on when He would give them the land of Canaan, despite the walled cities and the giants and the armies living there. This has this idea of God's power intervening and changing things. A lot of times we kind of think of God in almost sort of a passive sort of way, but God also intervenes and takes action and makes things happen that would not have happened. And this is what Isaac is conferring upon Jacob, that God will, in His mighty power, will intervene and take action on your behalf. And then will make you fruitful and increase your numbers. And of course, this is explicitly a part of the Abrahamic covenant, because that was one of the first things that He said to Abraham, who was aged and didn't have any children, but He said, I'm going to make your descendants as the sands of the sea and the stars up in the heaven. Look up in the sky if you can count the stars. That's how many your descendants will be. Well, He confers this part of the Abrahamic covenant upon Jacob, that his descendants will be many and will become an entire community. And of course, we know how many kids Jacob had, so he took that seriously, didn't he? And may He give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham. And so He is specifically calling upon the Abrahamic covenant here. And then ultimately, so that you may take possession of the land. So this is that second part of the covenant, where the land promises of the covenant, where He was going to give them the land that He had called Abraham to originally. At this point, he's living there as an alien. We talked about aliens before a couple of weeks ago, about our perspective of being aliens here in this world, because we're not citizens here, our citizenship is somewhere else. Well, at this point, he's sort of living in this area, but he's an alien. It doesn't belong to him. The Canaanites still, at this point, own this land and this territory. So he's saying, I am telling you that as part of this covenant, I'm passing upon you that you will take possession of this land. So God will ultimately give this land to Jacob and, of course, most specifically, to his many descendants. So this is basically the Abrahamic covenant being restated to Jacob through his father Isaac. So all of that is the background to this one verse in Hebrews 11:20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. So Isaac, remembering the words that God had spoken to Rebekah, that the older will serve the younger. And despite the fact that his wife and his son deceived him initially into bestowing this fatherly blessing on Jacob instead of Esau, which was what his intention had been, Because Isaac had intended to do what everybody did in that culture, pass the blessing on to the elder son. He was wise enough at that point in his life to realize that it was God's will all along that Jacob was going to be that chosen son. And as I said, this is a vivid example, like I said earlier, of God using and even overriding the bad intentions of sinful people doing stupid things to nonetheless further his will and his plan. Like I said, even our sin and our treachery cannot derail God's plan, his promises and his covenant especially. So he realized, that's why I said the second part of the blessing was so important, because Isaac, in his later years, realized that this was God's plan all along. He realized it was God's intention. He put two and two together. I'm sure he was aware of what God told Rebekah. And he realized that this was God's plan all along. That Jacob was to be the son of promise. So Isaac trusted what God had said, that the elder would serve the younger. Isaac trusted God's working in his life, and in this second blessing, knowingly bestowed that covenantal version of the blessing to Jacob and his descendants. Now, it mentions that he blessed Jacob and Esau. Well, even though materially he didn't have anything left to give Esau, he nonetheless pronounced what limited blessing upon him that he could, knowing and trusting that even though that Esau was also a descendant of Abraham. And so he was going to know some of Abraham's, or the Abrahamic blessing as well, because he was still the child of Abraham also. And so a recipient of some aspect of the promise. And so he passed on what blessing he could. So what was his display of faith? What was it that by faith Isaac saw? Why did the author of Hebrews bring out this particular aspect of his life to be an example? And I think, the way I interpret this, the way it hits me when I'm reading it, is that Isaac ultimately saw that God's plan was greater than all of them, and greater than what their individual intentions had been, and that God's plan was more about their descendants than them individually, and that their part was to be the avenue of God's blessing through the line of descendants from Abraham to the Messiah. They had a part to play, but that God's plan was bigger than them. And that God's ultimate purpose was in bringing the Messiah to the world and redeeming the world. And that Isaac had the humility to realize it's not about me. And it's not even about Jacob. It's about the covenant. It's about the people. It's about God's people, God's children. And we know ultimately the Messiah. So that was the level of Isaac's faith that was important at this point. Realizing it's not about you. Realizing that we're just part of God's plan. We aren't God's plan. It's bigger than all of us. And that no matter what we do, we can't frustrate it. We can't change it. It is what it is going to be. And that God can use us even when we mess it up beyond recognition. God still found a way to make his covenant promise, even with the soap opera that happened. So that's fascinating to me and reassuring. It's reassuring to me because it means I can't mess up God's plan no matter how bad I screw up. God is going to fulfill his plan in the way he wants, and I can't screw it up.